Action.
Thank you. Okay, so the first question, and it doesn't identify who sent it in, is does anyone know where Grandma and Grandpa met? Meaning, okay, Uncle Jack, you think you know.
Grandma was working as a secretary in Grandpa Levitz's real estate office.
Okay.
And somebody came in who says, I have a guy for you. And he's a really great catch. You should go out with him. So it was kind of a blind date.
Anybody dispute that, or is that everyone's story? Okay. And the next question
I
was...
heard a slightly different. I heard a slightly different version.
Story from your Florence.
Well, you're not on the panel, so you have to wait and let them...
Well,
You can tell us which one's telling the truth.
no, it's not.
It's like the game.
It's not the question of truth or false. It's just a question of received traditions. I heard that a gentleman who did business with my grandfather said to my mother that he had a friend who needed some help getting things typed, and could she please help him out? And of course, that guy was my father. And so my father came with some document to be typed or something, and my mother typed it up.
I never heard that story. Did you ever hear that
I think this
story?
is how Sybil's parents met. Okay.
All right, well, that's the version. That's the version I heard.
What's your story?
No, I heard something.
What Jack said.
I tell a story.
Okay, the follow-up question.
Uncle Toddy has a...
I have a related story.
Okay, go.
About 20 years ago, a customer of mine called me, and he was giving me an order, and then he said, look, I got a guy from the Bronx here in my office, and he's a real pain. He buys stuff for flea markets. You want to talk to him? He said, you're from the Bronx. He's from the Bronx. Talk to him. So I said, okay. The guy was about 80 years old. He gets on the phone, and he says to me, he grew up in the Bronx. I said, yeah, all right, where'd you die? And he said, the Bronx Jewish Center. I said, oh, the Bronx Jewish Center. That's where my father started the Young Israel of Tremont. We went on for a while, and then he said, yeah, is that, who was your father? I said, Charles Levine. He said, oh, you mean the guy that married the Levitas girl?
So the next question was, did you know anything about their childhood? I don't remember Grandma talking about her childhood really at all. She spoke about her father, and we were aware of how, some of her stature, but not her childhood.
My grandfather was a very good businessman, but when the time came for them to move to, quote, the country, instead of buying on the Grand Concourse and Fordham Road, which would have been worth a fortune, he bought a house on a small dead-end street off Webster Avenue, Ford Street. And across the street, there were some rocks, which to this day are still there because no one wanted to blast through the rocks. Grandma's house, your great-grandmother's and great-great-grand, that house was torn down, and they put up public housing for some reason on that little street. At the end of the street, there were steps, the equivalent of maybe 5 stories, that the city had put up, and you could walk from down in the valley of Webster Avenue up to the level of the Grand Concourse. But my mother used to, and her siblings used to play on the rocks across the street, and a couple of times she fell and split open her skull. So, not too bad, but the rocks are there. Her house is gone, but the rocks are still there, and the steps are still there, as far as I know.
And I have some independent corroboration of that story.
Again?
I beg your pardon?
I said again?
Yeah. We have a very distant relative by the name of Harry Barton, who lived at various times in his life in Erie, Pennsylvania, and after his father died, and he and his mother and her sister were left without a father, my grandfather took them in on Ford Street. Where he put them in a little house, I don't know. But he was eternally grateful for this kindness, and my mother remembers playing with him as a little girl. And when she found out that I was going to spend a lot of time in West Virginia, she said, oh, look up my cousin Harry Barton. And I finally connected with him. He was living in the Charleston, which is the capital, and I was out in the boondocks, but I finally caught up with him. And he was always very gracious and warm to me because of the kindness that my mother's family had shown to him at a hard time.
So my mother was a very good linguist, or at least she was a great grammarian, and she got the French medal, which I think, Beth, you have. Karen has it, one of them.
Nobody guessed me. Thank you very much. Kidding.
You weren't there.
Okay.
And then in high school, she did a semester of Latin over the summer.
Sorry.
Because her brothers preceding her were also good linguists or grammarians, and so the school let her do a year, 6 months of Latin on her own. My mother went to Evander Childs High School, as did at least one of her sisters, my Aunt Esther. And Aunt Esther was president of the student organization when they built this building, and her name is in the cornerstone if they ever tear the building down. And that building became, after Evander Childs moved again to a brand-new building, that building became an annex of Hunter College, and then it became Bronx High School of Science, where we all went, and then it became Bronx Community College. You didn't go, right? We all went. Then it became Bronx Community College, and I don't know what it is today, but the building, as far as I know, is still standing.
There's one other piece of trivia. Very close to where this little tiny street, Fort Street was the four-room schoolhouse, 6, that my mother went to when she was, a little girl. And the building stood at least till the 1950s and was actively used as a small elementary school.
Along those lines, some of the early buildings of the Bronx Zoo were put up.
In your backyard.
No, that was later on. I'll get to that question. But Grandma used to go to the Bronx Zoo when those buildings were brand new in like 1906, 1908, 1909. They were the subject of Shabbos walks from 4th Street to Bronx Park.
It wasn't such a big walk.
She also had a bruised, I guess, thumbnail that when she was young, it was caught at a door that was being closed, and it never recovered. So all her life, she had these beautiful nails on all her other fingers except that thumb.
They had, at that time, instead of having doors that opened and closed like this, they were like sliding doors, like you can find in Victorian houses today. That's the kind of door she caught her finger in.
Okay, so the next question, I know that in the Toddy Levine house, we always heard music. We always had jazz in the background. The house has been overwhelmed with books. The question was your house growing up filled with books and music like Toddy's house is? And I actually don't know if each of your homes are as well. But pretty much my childhood, there was always music on. There was always something in the background. And we're curious whether that came from your own childhood experiences, whether my father just likes to collect stuff and listen to music. Collect.
Could I make an opening remark is that I think Toddy absorbed most of the musical talent in the family and made most of the music. And he had 2 wonderful instruments. Somehow there was an old piano in our basement. And Toddy would go down to the basement, and for an hour or 2, he would pound away in rhythm.
Wow.
I don't know where this I'm talking about the piano on Tremont Avenue. No, I don't know where that piano came from.
Aunt Dora.
Aunt Dora? Okay, I didn't know that. Thank you.
Aunt Dora got a new piano, and she gave us her old player piano.
That's right, it was a player piano.
So
But
you
when
thought
Toddy-
it was my father being amazing, but it was actually just playing itself.
You got it. But in addition to that, he was the only one of us that got formal training in playing an instrument, and that instrument was the trumpet.
Yeah, it's still in
And
his
he
house.
was a pretty good trumpeter. And maybe he absorbed all the musical training that was going to be allocated to our family. I don't know.
Okay. Okay, next question is, does anybody know how far back, so the question was, who's the earliest ancestor we can trace back to? Karen says Israel Kaplan, who died around 1840, was the third great-grandfather of you guys. Do you guys have any with genealogy or what you knew? Nothing.
We defer to Karen.
Okay. How about your grandparents? Do you remember your grandparents?
Yeah.
Okay, I don't mean like yes or no. The question's like yes, no. It's a very short day.
Actually, I do remember my grandparents very well, except for my grandfather on my father's side. That picture that you saw on the table of me in the carriage with Grandpa Levine, next to it is the only picture that I know about him with me. I was the only grandson carried the name Levine that he ever saw. My other grandparents I remember very well. I remember my father's mother, Kasha. I remember her very well. She didn't speak too much English, but I do remember her very well. And we used to visit her a lot when we visited the cousins, especially when they lived in the Bronx. And parenthetically, my grandmother on my father's side used to run this organization on the east side called the Jewish Sisters Mutual Aid Society. It was a Gemila Chesed organization, and she was the head of it, and I guess the driving force behind it. In any event, when people used to come to the group to get aid and financial help, my grandmother used to keep notes in these journals, these hard-covered, big journal ledger books. She used to make notes and tell stories about these people who came for help, and I guess she recorded what their decisions was and how they were going to help these people. There were volumes and volumes of these books. Except for one, they were all donated to the YIVO in New York, and they're in I think it's on 23rd Street where that museum is now. Those volumes are someplace in their archives, and I believe maybe Cousin Arnold Cohn has the one existing book that's in the family still. My other grandparents, my grandfather Levitus, we remember very well, especially around Hanukkah time when he used to give us a Hanukkah gelt, and we used to visit with him. He used to smoke a cigar. I remember that very well, and he was a nice man who I didn't know 100% well, but I knew him enough to appreciate that he was a special person. My grandmother Levitus was someone who I knew very, very well. No matter whenever I was away from home, especially when I was in the service, whenever I came home, I had to go visit Grandma. It was a must, and I used to take the trolley down to the cross Tremont Avenue down to Webster, and then up on Webster Avenue, went north until I got off at 4th Street, walk up the hill to visit Grandma, who always had some kind of a soda to give me, and we schmoozed for a little while. I'd see her cats, I'd see her backyard, and we had a lot to say to each other. She used to write letters. She wrote letters to me while I was in the service, which I still have. I have a few of them, yes. And by the way, I remember in 1938, I don't remember it, but I have the siddur, Grandpa Levitus gave all of his grandchildren Sidurim with inscriptions, a handwritten inscription in them to each of us. You probably all have them someplace in your homes. Now, Grandma Levitus gave me a lot of very interesting experiences, one of which, or a few of which I could describe to you. One, I remember very clearly, we went downtown to Town Hall in New York because Rabbi Herzog was there, was visiting America, and he was giving a lecture, and my grandmother wanted to go, and I was elected to take her. So he was the chief rabbi of Palestine at the time. Anyhow, the interesting thing about Rabbi Herzog was, and I can't tell you what he said, I just remember he had this brogue, an Irish brogue, because he came from Ireland before he came to Israel. And the other thing I remember doing with Grandma, which I've spoken about a few times, I used to go to the Lowe's Paradise. The Lowe's Paradise was a theater, a movie theater on the concourse, the best theater, the most impressive theater in the Bronx. And in those days, people used to stand on line, believe it or not, lines to see a movie on a Saturday night especially. The line would go for a full block. And if you and it was usually a double feature maybe, but when you went in, it didn't matter when you went in. You guys are probably used to going to the movie when it starts. In those days, you went wherever the movie was, and you sat through till you got to the part. This is where we came in, and you'd leave. Anyway, what we used to do is my grandmother used to take me with her on these nights when there were lots of people, and with a pushka, we would move down the aisle together, down the line. Please help the Jewish National Fund. And that's what I did with my grandmother, so I remember that very well. And then she used to come to our house every year for the Siddharam. She would come to us, and she used to come to us frequently on Yom Tov also. And she was always a very interesting, personable person to be with. And when we went away like we went to a hotel once in a while, and Grandma would go with us, and guess who her roommate was? And so I had a lot of exposure to my wonderful grandmother. I have very good memories of her. And she was at Trudy and my wedding, and I don't remember if she was. No, I don't think she was around when Toby.
It had to be for Toby, right? Or not yet? But yet.
Yeah, right. So she was here for Toby, right? So she saw one of her great grandchildren. I just wanted to say one more thing. My grandmother was a very smart woman. When Grandpa Levitas came to America in the 1880s, late 1880s, Grandma was stayed in Europe. Grandma didn't come over here to marry him until after he brought over her 3 brothers.
So you have to, I was about 6 when my grandfather Levitas died. But Murray had an aunt who used to say, gista bista, which means you give and they remember. And when he came to the house, he always had a package of charms, candies.
Lifesavers.
Charms. They had little wrappers around them. And he always gave us a charm when he came over, and that's, I think, why I remember him so well. My grandmother...
Is that why Grandma always had candy in her bag?
Same thing.
That's funny. She had those... No, she had those
Or shiny
lemon
pennies.
and the like mints with the red crosses.
Right.
No, we got chewing gum. First it was chewing
Well, she liked us better, so we got sucking candies. Like her...
red and white.
The red and white ones, right? Yeah.
So, now where was I? So, my grandfather always gave us the charms, and that's one of the reasons why I remember him. One summer, Toddy was in camp, and there was a guest house at the camp. And I was there in the guest house with the twins, and Toddy was a camper. And I was maybe a year younger than the kids in the regular bunks. And they said to my mother, why don't you put her in a bunk? So they put me in a bunk, and that was fine. And my grandfather gave me a whole package of charms, all for myself, which was instead of... And I really didn't want to share them with anybody, and I kept them in my cubby. And I got paid off because I came to look at them one day, and they were covered with ants. So... Right, yeah.
You guys don't know. And were you too young? Were you guys too young to remember your grandparents?
No, I remember, I have a vague recollection of my father's mother. I have a stronger recollection of my mother's father because he would come to the house and he would knock on the window and show me the candy. And then I knew it was him and to let him in. And I heard stories that he was a very clever businessman and made several fortunes and really knew how to be a businessman and an entrepreneur. But to me, he was just this nice old man who brought over the candy. His wife, my grandmother, I have more vivid memories because for years she came for every Pesach. And when I went to high school, she lived around the corner from the high school. So I would sometimes go and visit her. And I seem to have had a perpetual career of fixing her doorbell, which isn't hard to do, but it seemed like every summer the doorbell broke, and I had to come back and fix it again. It was an old house.
Wasn't it an electric bell?
No, well, she had 2 bells. She had an electric bell, and she had a
Mechanical.
mechanical. You turned this knob, and it rang it made a noise like a grogger, except it was a bell, and that never broke. And she also had a stand-up telephone, very old phone that would be in the museum today, and it was not on a table. It was attached to the wall with a separate earphone and a separate speaker.
Arthur has that.
The other part about the house in Fort Street is it didn't have any radiators or forced air heating. It had a furnace in the basement, and there were grates, and the hot air would rise from the basement up through the grates, and it must have been damn cold on the second and third floors. I don't know.
Wow.
But Uncle Toddy talks about visiting and getting soda and things like that to drink. When I used to visit her after coming home from high school, she had nothing under her table but bottles of Sacramento wine. So I'd walk in there and she'd pour me half a cup of Manischewitz. Boy, what a bomb that was.
So Grandma Levitus was an educated woman. She came from a more progressive part of Europe, perhaps, and she went to gymnasium, which was the equivalent of high school, before she came to America. I used to go to shul, walk over to her shul most Shabbosim, and she would walk up those flights of stairs, which must have been the equivalent of 5 floors, to get up to the level of the concourse, and then walk a couple of blocks to shul. And she did that till she was about 85 or so. So she was pretty good. And to the end, her mind was good and clear.
We have more questions, no worries. Sorry.
About that stand-up phone, that wouldn't happen to still be existing. Like anyone could
If it still exists, it's in Grandpa's basement. So, have it.
Could you repeat the question, because we're not going to hear what he said.
He was asking if the stand-up phone still existed anywhere, and I said if it exists anywhere, it's in Grandpa's basement.
I don't think so.
So the next question has to do with your aunts and uncles. I remember Aunt Yemima because Karen and I stayed with Aunt Yemima and Uncle Julius. I remember Aunt Esther because we thought she was a lot of fun, and Uncle Pace because he always had a cigar in his mouth. Is that right? The question speaks to who your favorite aunts and uncles were, and tell us something about them. And Dora looked like Grandma, just with red hair.
So I think we were closest to Dora and Doc. Dora was my mother's oldest sister, so maybe there was 10 years in between them. And Dora was almost like a second mother to my mother. And I think and Uncle Doc used to come over to our house almost every Shabbos and have tea and cookies or whatever with us. He was a great tennis player, and if you're a really good tennis player, you don't like to use a ball too often. So he was a great uncle because he always brought over bags of used tennis balls. And if you take the cover off a tennis ball, there's a Spalding underneath. Maybe you didn't know that, but we did. On my father's side, I think Yemima and Julius were the aunt and uncle that we felt closest to. Yemima's grandson is Jack and Fran's neighbor. Right? And so what comes around goes around, whatever.
Well, it's a hard question to answer. I think clearly my Aunt Dora and her husband, who we all called Uncle Doc, because he was indeed a doctor, and he was our doctor. And he also lived very close to the high school where Jack and I went. So, and Benita as well. So, and I think, I'm not quite sure why Uncle Doc came religiously every Shabbos afternoon, but I have a feeling it was to get away.
Aunt Dora.
Yeah.
Came to check up on Daddy.
He also came to check up on my father, but I think he gave him hay fever shots. But I think he just wanted a little Sorry? Reprieve is a good word. On my father's side, we had some fascinating aunts and uncles. The one who we were most impressed by was the one we saw the least of. My father's sister Miriam and her husband Zelig had a candy store on Broadway about near Dyckman Street. And at the end of World War II, they produced bubble gum, which had been banned during the World War I. It was II, rather. I don't know why they. Maybe they gave it to the soldiers, or maybe it used sugar or rubber. I don't know. But at the end of the war, all of a sudden, bubble gum became available, and the first bubble gum I ever got came from Aunt Miriam and Uncle Zelig's store, and it was a big treat. But the relative that on my father's side was his sister Yemima, and she lived about, what would you say, 15 minutes from our house? And it was a convenient place to walk to on a Shabbos afternoon. And I remember once getting on a bus with my Uncle Julius, who was Yemima's husband, and with my cousin, and Julius looked around, he saw there were four of us, he said to the bus driver, "Party of four," and put 80 cents in the coin backs. He had a twinkle. The other thing about Uncle Julius was, in those days, and we're talking about the 1950s and 60s, it was very hard to be in business and be Shomer Shabbos. Uncle Julius, Yemima's husband, and his brother were in the dress business together. And I was shocked one Sunday morning when I was going to Hebrew High School. At about 8 o'clock on a Sunday morning, there was Uncle Julius on the subway station waiting to take the train to go to work because the shop had been closed on Shabbos, and the only way he could make up for it was to come in on Sunday.
So my grandfather, Levitas, one of the things that he did when he came to this country was he sold insurance. And I think that involved like going from door to door and collecting 10 or 15 cents from each person to pay for their policy. And he did not work on Shabbos. And when the insurance company found out that he wasn't working on Shabbos, they fired him. And he was a man, he had several children. What was he going to tell his wife? The story goes that he came home and there was an insurance person from a rival company who heard he'd been fired and said, "Come work for us." So he was a good salesman.
One of the interesting stories that I learned from some of our Weller cousins was that during the Depression, my father bought a candy store for his sister Miriam and her husband, Uncle Selig, and that was their living. So if they had not gotten that candy store through my father's good graces, they wouldn't have been able to survive, basically. So our cousins in Chicago, the Weller cousins in Chicago, still tell the story of our father buying their grandfather a candy store so they could survive the Depression.
So my parents during the Depression had a lot of money. Unfortunately, my father got involved in a bad deal and lost a lot of money. But during the Depression, many people had no work. He helped support Miriam and another uncle he put into the exterminating business. And he helped them get through. And it's true, my parents had to help buy clothing for those children because people just didn't have money. If they didn't have a job, it was terrible times.
I want to tell you an Uncle Julius story. It was my Ufruf. It was the Friday right before my Ufruf, when we, just the weekend we were going to get married. And my in-laws, my father, Oliver Shalom, bought me a new tallis to wear at my Ufruf. So it had a tag on it, and I wanted to get the tag off, of course, before Shabbos. So I cut the tag, and at the same time, you did it maybe, and at the same time, cut the tzitzis, so it came loose from the tallis. So here I was, a few hours away from Shabbos. It was time for my Ufruf the next day, and I had a tallis with only 3 tzitzis. What should we do? Who knew what to do? Uncle Julius. So I think one of the twins went over to Uncle Julius's house. Uncle Julius meticulously took tzitzis off one of his talasim and attached it to mine. So it was so I had the 4 bags. So now I had 4 tzitzis, but Uncle Julius's was about 2 inches longer than the other 3. I used that talis for I don't know, 10, 12, 15 years, and every time I davened, I thought of Uncle Julius.
That's a nice story.
Okay, so a follow-up or? No, please go.
So, what was involved in maintaining the house back then? What were your roles as far as chores?
You will find this hard to believe.
Repeat the question.
What were our roles in the maintenance of the house? Well, it was all downhill in a way. Because remember, my parents moved into that house 1931, 1932, 33, which was the depths of the Depression. And they were able to employ at least 2 people to take care of the family and the house. We had a chauffeur, because my father, the story is that he had a car accident while he was driving and badly messed up his face. And after that accident, he vowed he would never drive a car again, but he needed to be taken from place to place. So we had a chauffeur,
/
handyman, who did a lot of things around the house. We had I don't know what you would call her, a nursemaid?
We had a nanny, a nursemaid, who basic job was to take care of us, but she also did things around the house. And a couple of times a week, my mother had someone to come in to do the heavy cleaning. And the laundry, Lena. And the maid was Julia. And the laundry got sent out. The laundryman would come every week, and he'd take my father's shirts and the bed linen and take them and launder them, and then bring it back the following week and take away the dirty laundry.
However, as time went on and the budget got smaller, a lot of the maintenance around the house was assumed by the residents. And we had varying abilities.
You already heard, my father could play the tuba, what the rest of you, or trumpet. What the rest of you guys do?
We cut the hedges, we painted the fence, shoveled the snow, cleaned the gutters. I tried to do a garden in the back and made an amazing discovery about biology. I ordered a couple of sacks of well-rotted cow manure, which is very good fertilizer, but it also contains a lot of weed seeds, and those weeds were much.
So wait, you were growing weed in the backyard?
But we had a great crop of radishes.
That's right. We became very adept at snow shoveling.
How about the blizzard in 1947?
Well, that was an interesting event. There was indeed a blizzard in 1947. I think it was at the end of December. Do you remember?
Yeah, it was around Christmas.
Around Christmas.
And
And
in school anyway.
that's also true. But there was a bus across the street that got stuck, couldn't go up the hill. So it stayed there for about 2 days. And so we offered the bus driver, and because all the diners and luncheonettes were closed, we sent over a little bit of food for him.
That would have been my mother, who was a thoughtful person that way.
By the way, we had a wonderful neighbor on Tremont Avenue where we lived, the Fontaine family, who we became very close to, especially the mother of the family, who was an older person, older than our family. And she lived there with her son, who was a bachelor in his 40s, I guess, late 30s, and her daughter, who at the time was not married, she was a voice coach. In any event, they used to shovel their walk, too. And when...
But then walk from here to here.
No, but whatever it was, my mother would not let me take a nickel from them for doing it. She said, "You're just doing it because you're a good neighbor, no money." And that's how I did it. I did it for free. I just wanted to briefly tell you about Harry, who was really an important part of our childhood. As you were told already, Harry was our chauffeur handyman. Harry was married to a woman who worked in the post office and had a son. It was his. He was the stepfather of that young man. And when Harry used to do the shoveling of our snow, and sometimes when he couldn't do it, his stepson would come over and do it. Harry started us on stamp collecting. Harry built bicycles for us out of spare part bicycles. Harry built my train tracks in the basement of the house when somebody once gave me a train set. Harry built model airplanes with us. Harry played a lot of roles in the family and was really an intricate part of the family for many years. When as the war went on and the price of gasoline was rationed and it was hard to get, and my father had reversals, we kept getting smaller cars because it was easier in terms of getting gas. My father used to drive around the city a lot to visit his real estate properties. In any event, so we ended up, we used to have these cars with the jump seats. A jump seat is a seat that's in front of the 3 in the back that you usually have nowadays. So we could sit 5 in the back, and my father would sit in the seat in the front next to the driver, even though that was the most dangerous seat in the car, and even though he didn't like to drive itself, but that's the seat he always sat in. Anyway, as time went on, we could not keep that big car any longer, so we got a very small car called the Willys. It was a tiny car, and how could we all get into that car? So we used to put 2 small chairs from a kiddie set in the back of the car, and that's how we got the 5 of us in the back and my father in the front, and the whole family in the one car, which was a small car, smaller than any car you are driving today. And then, did I tell you this the last time? If I did, you can stop me, about the bike. My father bought a bicycle. He figured sooner or later there's going to be no gas. So he bought a bicycle, and we put it in what we called the big room in the basement, which was like a playroom. And nobody was allowed to ride that bike because it was my father's bike. I used to oil it. I used to spin the wheels, turning it upside down. I used to polish it. Finally, he let me ride it. But I wasn't allowed to let anybody ride that bike except me. So I took it out on the street, and after many years, a friend of mine said, "Please let me have a ride on the bike. I just want to go around the corner. I'll be back in 5 minutes." I said, "Okay." So he came back in 10 minutes and with a broken handlebar. I was worried very much about what's going to happen because my father would be very upset, I would guess, about a broken handlebar. Fortunately, he didn't get too upset, and fortunately, the fellow who broke it fixed it, got a new one, and so all ended well.
Did Daddy even know how to ride a bike?
Not that I'm aware of.
Just speaking about the war, when World War II started, they repeated something that had been done in World War I. They started a draft, and all males above the age of 18 to 50 had to register for the draft. Now, fortunately, they were not taking men in their 30s with children. So the possibility of my father being drafted was, the enemy would have had been at the gates of the city. But the notion that my father had a draft card and potentially could become a soldier just was mind-boggling, because we didn't think he could get into, he was kind of stocky. We didn't think he could climb into a tank. But fortunately, he was never called up, and I don't know what happened to that draft card, but he was exempt from being drafted.
Although he had a draft card, he did not have citizenship papers, which nobody knew until I think into the 50s, when people began to get concerned about people who come from Russia living in the United States. Now, my father had fled Russia, so he wouldn't be in the Tsar's army, but he never finished his citizenship. Either he or my aunts were U.S. citizens. They voted religiously, but they were not citizens.
The story that I heard was that he thought he was a citizen on his father's papers, but that wasn't true, and then it was too late to pursue it any further. You guys ever hear that?
Yes. In fact, I'm not sure that he ever tried to resolve the problem.
That one bothers you, I won't bother them.
What about the tradespeople in the neighborhood, the shops in the neighborhood, the tradespeople that come? Did you have trucks and things like that that came to the house? Did you have people come to the house to take care of things, or did you have to send things out? Did you
Well, first of all,
shops in walking distance?
there was lots of shops. But the question, as I understand it, is where did we get our stuff, and who came by to fix things? Well, first of all, within a 3-minute walk of our house were 2 drugstores, and one would never close till the other did. There were 2 what we call candy stores, which were stores that sold school notebooks, ice cream, newspapers, and the one that was further from where we lived was very proud of the fact that he ran a dry store. He didn't sell ice cream or soda. The one that's closest to the house was the Kramer's store. And if we got our report cards, we were we were given 10 cents, and we could buy an ice cream soda at the Kramer's. The rest of the year, for a nickel, we could have an ice cream cone. In those days, there were a lot of newspapers published. And in our house, every day, 5 newspapers came in, including, in English, the Journal American, the World Telegram, the Sun, the Times, the Herald Tribune, the Mirror. We didn't buy the news because they were not viewed as being friendly to Jews. But we bought every other paper that was a daily, and the Yiddish paper from the Kramers. And
in those days, they would leave the papers in front of the store, and you would just put down a nickel or whatever and take your paper, and you didn't have to go inside to make the transaction. I said that the Kramers used to sell all these papers in their candy store. They had a stand in front of it, and you just put down a nickel or 2 cents or whatever the paper cost, and you took your paper, and they trusted you.
Is there any custom or manner of dress that you miss from those days? Is there any style that you wish they would bring back? Is there any custom that you wish continued today?
the question is, are there any clothing or costumes, articles that we had in those days that you miss today? I will tell you one that I hated. It was called knickers. They were pants that stopped here, and then you had long socks. And they were made out of corduroy, which is an indestructible material. And we were so delighted, finally, maybe by 5th grade, we were finally able to get long pants. But until then, we wore these damn knickers. And one of the problems with them was that they would fall, the top, the knicker, the cuff was a piece of elastic around your long socks. And sometimes it would fall, so you'd walk lopsided. The right side would be down to your shoes, the left side would be up at the top of the sock. And we were very glad to get rid of them. I think maybe they lasted for us until 4th grade.
And the corduroy made a noise. Swish, swish, swish.
What was the best advice Granny and Grandpa ever gave you guys? What was the best advice Granny and Grandpa ever gave you guys?
I don't think he ever gave me specific advice that I can remember, but I can tell you from watching him, and the most important thing I think I remember about my father was that he treated every person equal. He was able to identify with any personality that he met, any economic level that these people were in, any education level that they had. He could work with them, talk with them, and they would be friendly to him, and he would be friendly to them, and he would really care about them. I remember so well when he bought that building on 163rd Street, which turned out to be his nemesis. He walked around to the stores that people had. There were stores on the lowest level of the building, and he met this man who was a shoemaker. He had a shoe store, a shoemaker maybe, it was a shoe repair shop. And the guy said, it seemed he was closed on, he was a Shomer Shabbos guy. And most stores were not. So my father said to him, you close on Shabbos? And he said, yeah. My father said, you're fair. You know, like it was a beautiful thing that he saw that. And he was able to, he could be anywhere, any person, anytime, and fit right in with them. And we were told very often that my father was the life of the party, which we really didn't know that part of him that well. But he was always a respected man. He respected my friends. My friends, he used to call them by their last name, Mr. Goldberg, Mr. Moskowitz, Mr. Wendrow, whatever their name was, he treated them with respect. And they treated him the same way. And they never called him anything but Mr. Levine, where many of my friends spoke to the other parents, called them by their first name, which was something that we never did, no matter who it was. In Kramer's candy store, everybody called Mr. Kramer Al, and everybody called Mrs. Kramer, I forgot her name, Ada, and we only called them Mr. Kramer and Mrs. Kramer. That's the way we were brought up. In any event, my father taught me, and us, I think all of us, how to respect the other person, and I think that was the greatest lesson he gave us.
Incidentally, Mr. and Mrs. Kramer had 3 children. All 3 of their children had at least a college degree, and perhaps further than that.
I have a question. Can you walk us through your house? Whose rooms were where? Whose rooms? Your house. Tell us about your house, where your steps, where your rooms were in the house.
You walked into the house, and there was a small vestibule. As you walked through the door, you faced this large Magi statue of I think he must have been he was a warrior or a scribe or something. It was Japanese, and God knows where my father picked it up, but it was at least as tall as I am. And when my mother sold the house, Murray had it sold somewhere to some fancy store on the east side of Manhattan. Then you walked in, and there was like a side hall that had enough room for a telephone table and another table and a bench, like with the TV, with the radio on it. And we used to sit there and listen to the radio because there was no TV. Off that corridor, there was the living room. There were French doors in the living room that connected to the dining room. So it was a living room with a fireplace, connecting doors to the dining room. So if we had a large party, they could open up the doors, push the table back, and have room for a lot of people. At the end of the corridor, there was a kitchen. On the back of the kitchen, there was a door that led out to the back porch. Then there was a staircase that you went up. There was a landing, and then you went up more, and there were 4 bedrooms. My parents' bedroom had a connecting bath to the bedroom that the twins used. At the top of the stairs, it was my bedroom, and at the end of the corridor was Toddy's room.
What about the attic?
And there were stairs that led up to the attic, which was partially finished, I would say. And my father had a whole bookshelves built there and tons of books up in the attic, which nobody ever touched. But very
And the
dusty.
basement? And the basement?
The basement had 4 rooms. One room was a laundry room with a bathtub off it, and there was a bathroom there too, right? Toilet, which we never used.
The bathroom was by the steps.
By the steps, right. And there was another room that Harry used for like a work room. He had tools and stuff in it. Off that, there was another room that used to be for holding coal. The coal truck would come into the back side yard and dump coal through a window into that room. We had what? The boiler was coal, and the rest of it was oil, and then we changed to oil all the way when the boiler, so we had no more coal. And there was one room that was really finished, and that's where the piano was and where we sometimes played.
And where'd Harry sleep?
Harry slept in his own home. He didn't sleep in.
Where did Harry sleep?
He didn't sleep at our house.
He didn't sleep in your house.
And then in
Okay.
the back, of a yard, we had a garage.
Quick question. There was a pair, Toddy, little Todd, there was a pair of barber clippers in your room or something? What? I remember a pair of, like, clippers that a barber shop would use. I think it was in Uncle Toddy's room. I was 2 years old, so I don't know.
That was the hedge clipper.
Hedge? No, I don't think it was I know it was not a hedge clipper, no. Okay. Just, again, memories of a 2-year-old.
Just wondering, what's the earliest computer you can remember your parents having? Like, or any type of a computer you'd say. What's the earliest computer? Yeah.
Did you have an adding machine?
Computer, anything.
What was the state of technology in your home? Repeat the question.
We had a radio.
Phonograph.
We had, when we were kids, we had wind-up phonographs. You'd wind it up, and the turntable would go around, and you'd play our kids' records, and then wind it up again and play another record.
You were actually the only people on the block with a phone at one point. No?
It was my grandfather's phone. The person with the only phone on the block was my grandfather Levitus.
Let me ask you, what's your memory when World War II broke out at Pearl Harbor?
I'll start if I may. I think they interrupted a radio broadcast of a program called The Shadow to announce that Pearl Harbor had been, that's my memory. But it's probably off a little bit because The Shadow played about 5 o'clock Sunday afternoon. And I think Pearl Harbor happened about noon time, Eastern time. But remember, it was a lot of time zones away.
I remember that it was in the afternoon that I heard about Pearl Harbor. I didn't understand it because I didn't know where Pearl Harbor was. I never heard of it before that day. Of course, the next day in school, they had in the school we were in was a very modern school. There was a new building at PS 26, and they had speakers in every room. And we heard President Roosevelt make his famous Day of Infamy speech. And then the war went on. And we didn't. We were all lucky enough to be too young to go to war, but we had cousins, and we had friends, many friends, and lots of people from the neighborhood who went into the Army during that time. Buddy Fontaine, for one, and many others. Meyer Weintraub, I remember a lot of guys who went in. Some didn't come back.
Final words.
We didn't get presents for Hanukkah. We got, the question was, what did we get for Hanukkah? We got Hanukkah Gelt on one night of Hanukkah, and that was it. It wasn't the big production that it is today.
Hopefully we'll see you next year. Yitz Hashem.
As the youngest member of the oldest generation, it falls upon me to thank you all for having put all the effort into making this happen. So we really appreciate the fact that the younger generations are pitching in to make this go on. So more power to you, and keep it going.
And we love you. And we love you all.